It is my pleasure to chair the third part of the World War II Witnesses and Memory series delivered by the Pilecki Institute, Warsaw, Poland, and the National WWII Museum in New Orleans, USA. World War II was fought across the globe in Europe, in Asia, in the Pacific, and in Africa. From its very beginning, in September 1939, it was tainted with egregious violence towards non-combatants. In Poland, it has been remembered as a nationwide disaster that destroyed the Polish state, eradicated the 3 million strong Jewish community, and killed more than 2.5 million Poles, mostly civilians. The surviving population was traumatized and fell victim to the communist regime installed with the mighty presence of the Red Army. The American memory about World War II represents clearly different perspective. The right war, or the good war, fought with great sacrifice by millions of Americans, recognized as the greatest generation in the field and on the home front. The war, however, that came with a cost, the terrible and increasing violence against civilian populations. World War II memory has been challenged and will be challenged by the coming generations. Do our memories have anything in common? Are there universal elements of the World War II memory? What can we learn from one another in terms of what and how to remember about the war? All this and more will be discussed in the coming hour and 15 minutes. Let me welcome warmly the panel. Dr. Gordon H. Nick Mueller is the President and CEO Emeritus of the National WWII Museum in New Orleans. Dr. Mueller assisted historian Stephen Ambrose in founding the institution, initially known as the National D-Day Museum, and led the organization as chairman of the board during its fundraising and construction for its grand opening on June 6, 2000. He then served as president and CEO of the museum from 2000 until he stepped down in 2017 to take on his current emeritus role. Today, he'll be commenting on the witness accounts we're going to hear and watch and reflect on violence against civilians as an important factor in how we remember World War II. Dr. Robert Citino is the executive director of the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy and the Samuel Zemurray Stone Senior Historian. Dr. Citino is an award-winning military historian and scholar who has published 10 books, including The Wehrmacht Retreats, Fighting a Lost War 1943, Death of the Wehrmacht, the German Campaigns of 1942, and the German Way of War, from the 30 Years' War to the Third Reich. In the panel today, however, he agreed to give us a unique insight to the cost of liberation by US troops and to challenges to memory it entails. And also, warm welcome to Tomasz Stefanek, who is a philosopher by training and the head of programs at the Pilecki Institute. He specializes in public history and memory culture. He contributed greatly to large exhibition projects, the Warsaw Rising 1944, set up in the topography of terror in Berlin, the Emigration Museum in Gdynia, and Raphael Lemkin, Witness to the Age of Genocide, which was displayed, among others, in United Nations headquarters in New York. And very recently, he also initiated a graduate program from American students together with Valdosta State University, Georgia, titled Totalitarianism in East Central Europe, 1939-1989, History and Memory. He will give us his perspective on the Polish accounts and the memory challenges about the Second World War that we have here in Poland. My name is Wojciech Kozłowski, director of the Pilecki Institute, and this is Memory Wars. Without further ado, I invite you to watch a 6-minute video with witness accounts, and Tomasz's remarks will follow. I hope you're going to enjoy this webinar.
Wojna to jest najgłupszy wynalazek ludzkości. Jest to coś potwornego i w wyobraźni tych, którzy nie uczestniczyli, a oglądali tylko na filmach, czytali, to jest zabawa. To jest w jakiś sposób oderwanie się od życia. Nie. To jest potworna rzecz. Rzecz, która niesie za sobą nie tylko olbrzymie straty ludzkie i materialne, ale wcale nie mniejsze straty natury psychicznej. Wszyscy uczestnicy wojny mają garby. Nikt z uczestników wojny nie wyszedł, powiedzmy, bez jakichkolwiek pozostałości, i to przykrych pozostałości po tej wojnie. Nie życzyłbym tym wszystkim młodym ludziom, żeby kiedykolwiek stanęli oko w oko z potrzebą uczestniczenia w wojnie. Ja z tej wojny wyszedłem bardzo, bardzo okaleczony i psychicznie, i fizycznie. I nie chciałbym, żeby w najmniejszym stopniu ktokolwiek musiał powtarzać to, co ja przeszedłem.
Postawiono dwa takie bloki drewniane, takie jak są, i na jednym umieszczono Polki, a na drugim były Żydówki. I tam dopiero się zaczęło, bo tam prawie do tego miejsca, gdzie był ten nasz blok, był wybudowany rampa. Pociągi dojeżdżały, no oczywiście przeładowane Żydami. I ci Żydzi, tych Żydów wyrzucano tak z tych takich jądlałych, i matki z dziećmi oddzielnie, wtedy mężczyźni na jedną stronę, kobiety na drugą. No i to wszystko szło do kąpieli. Trudno było na to patrzeć, nie umiałam się z tym pogodzić. Boże, to nie do zniesienia, no jak to, przecież to nie da się żyć w tym. Przecież to nie ma sensu życie. Jak? Przecież to ludzie idą prosto z wagonów, wchodzą do tej kąpieli, później widzimy tylko te ich ubrania wyrzucane i tylko ten dym z tych już palonych ciał. Nie wiedziałyśmy jeszcze sposobu, ale oczywiście wszystko już potem było wiadomo, jak to się dzieje. Oni od razu tam byli rozbierani, wyrzucali te rzeczy, a to byli czadem zatruci i palono. No i było tego dużo wciąż jechały te transporty i te takie szeregi kobiety z małymi, z różnymi dziećmi, niektóre na rękach. Inne tak szły pieszo, biegały, to tak się wyciągały, oddychały, rozciągały te rączki tak, żeby zduszone w tych wagonach. Okrutne, to nie do wiary, ja dzisiaj nawet nie mogę o tym mówić. A teraz z kolei to samo uczucie we mnie budzi się tak, jak to już troszeczkę się z tym oswoiłam, ale jak się zaczęło i usłyszałam polskie obozy zagłady. Czy wy sobie zdajecie sprawę, co ja przeżywam w tym czasie? Już teraz się przyzwyczaiłam, ale te początki, Jezus Maria, gdzie ja jestem? Polskie obozy zagłady, polskie obozy śmierci, w tym właśnie Oświęcim. Kto to wymyślił? Skąd to? Komu to przyszło do głowy? Dlaczego to się powtarza w telewizji, w radio? Przecież to jest coś niesamowitego. Jak można? I my to słuchamy, cośmy przeżyli to piekło.
Kiedy wojna się zaczęła, miałam 7 lat dużą rodzinę. Ja już nie mówię o moich kuzynach, ciotkach, wujkach, wszystkich tych. No i wojna się kończy, już nikogo nie ma. Trudno mi powiedzieć, dlaczego na mnie padło najsłabsza, najgłupsza, właściwie najmniej przedsiębiorcza. Przecież ten mój mały brat taki był naprawdę wspaniały. On nas uratował właściwie i on za 2 tygodnie umiera, a on nas wyprowadza. Ten znowu, każdy z tych wszystkich tych, a ja, mogę powiedzieć, zupełnie bierna. Może dlatego, że bierna, to znaczy, że się nie angażowałam w jakieś akcje, może dlatego przeżyłam, nie wiem. A może dlatego, żeby zostać świadkiem tej historii.
Tomasz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to speak up in such a company, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. As always in this series of partnered webinars, we are supposed to discuss witnesses and memory, but this time we focus on the memory wars. It is obviously a metaphorical expression, but somehow it refers to conflicts, tensions, quarrels over how people envision the past, and in this case, namely the history of the Second World War. Whereas witness is individual and rests on personal experience, memory, although it can also be individual, tends to become a collective phenomenon. And these are exactly collective and shared memories and collective identities that are based on shared memories that are engaged in memory wars on many different levels, internal within the societies, but also external when the memory conflict influences international relations, or when memory conflicts are used and abused in international politics, which also happens sometimes. And this connection between witness and memory is exactly the reason why we have chosen for today testimonies that have something in common. What brings them together is the witnesses' attempt to make or to discover a broader sense of their personal experience, to deliver some kind of message for the contemporary world and for the future generations. They not only report on what they have gone through, but they try to draw conclusions and to make generalizations. Our witnesses seek for sense and meaning in the history, as human beings usually do. However cruel and however violent this history might have been, and even though it sometimes appears completely senseless. Czesław Lewandowski, the one of our witnesses, says even at some point that war is the most foolish human invention, but still he on his own tries to make some general sense out of it. Czesław Lewandowski, the member of the Polish underground who fought in the Warsaw Uprising and the former inmate of the Stutthof concentration camp, who lost his father and 3 of his siblings in the war, stresses the physical and psychological, in terms of trauma, long-term consequences of the war for the individual. The message, and he wishes himself that really nothing similar to his fate becomes a share of anybody in the future. And this message of never again is a universal one. And it can, of course, imply a set of measures undertaken to avoid totalitarianism, genocide, and war of extermination in the future, the whole post-war system of peaceful coexistence and cooperation of states and nations. In the case of Krystyna Budnicka, the third of our witnesses, the Holocaust survivor, we encounter a very modest and moderate claim to a sense of her personal history. The lady who lost her entire family in the Holocaust, who was the only one to save her life, tries to figure out the meaning of her survival. And she supposes that her mission is just to bear witness, which in her case means to stand for those who perished, to represent their voice, to speak on their behalf. And in this case, this is indeed a story of losing her close ones one by one during the Holocaust, but also the story of their struggle to survive, to save their lives, and of how they were active in this fight. Finally, it is also a story of how they were helped and how they were betrayed. Krystyna Budnicka herself survived on the so-called Aryan side of the Warsaw after she had fled the Warsaw Ghetto. She survived with the help of extensive Polish underground network. But one of her brothers was denounced to the German by a Pole, an agent of Gestapo, who shockingly gave away not only the Budnicka's brother, but also his own father, the Warsaw housekeeper, who was sheltering the Jews. Both men were captured, arrested by the Germans, and killed consequently. So in this case, to bear witness means to give justice to the complexity of the wartime reality of occupied Poland, which includes the context in the first place, the organized system of lawlessness introduced by the Germans in the occupied Poland, aimed at destroying every bound of solidarity between Polish Jews and the Poles, punishing for every gesture of kindness, for every human act, and rewarding betrayal. But of course, this complex reality includes also various attitudes carried out by people involved in this morally very challenging situation. And this is probably the power to evoke such an awareness of complexity of the historical situation that makes the voices of survivors and witnesses so worthy and so priceless. The last testimony by Irena Wiśniewska touches directly upon a very turbulent and sensitive issue in Polish historical disputes. The lady, a former inmate of the Auschwitz concentration and death camp who lost her father in Auschwitz and who was, as we have heard, a very compassionate witness to the last final stage of the Holocaust at the selection at the infamous ramp in Birkenau. She is outraged and she even feels slandered by the phrases Polish concentration camps and Polish death camps appearing in the media and in public debates. Let's add, especially outside Poland, mostly in the English-speaking world. These expressions are indeed used in recent years less frequently than before, But still, in the most recent statistics by the Polish Foreign Ministry that I have come across informs about nearly 350 cases in the years 2018 and 2019 appearing in the world media, which of course does not include social media and which does not include related expressions as, for example, Polish ghetto or Nazi Poland, which also appear sometimes. And among many Poles, especially those who remember the war, as Irena Wiśniewska does, this phenomenon gives rise to suspicions that we face a kind of organized secret conspiracy to shift responsibility for the crimes of war from Nazi Germany to Poland, which can mean Polish government, which would be quite ridiculous given the fact that it was a government in exile working together with the Allies, or Polish nation, or Polish society. These suspicions, of course, unfounded and probably exaggerated, are still to some extent understandable. From my point of view, what lies at the bottom of this of the frequent usage of these phrases in the world is not, of course, a secret conspiracy, but rather a constant attempt to uphold a universal general framework of interpretation of German occupation and the Holocaust that would be valid in every case, for every country, and so to say, in every corner of Europe. This interpretation includes the victims of the Holocaust, the Jews. It includes the Nazi Germans as main perpetrators. It includes also their collaborators on many different levels and single individual rescuers. It is based on a sense of common guilt, even though in different degrees, and common responsibility. And as such, it delivers a very powerful moral message for the future that is used in education, preventing intolerance, hatred among different groups, biased attitudes, and so on. But at the same time, however, these interpretations leaves little place for other victims of Nazi German atrocities. And also it omits the specifics and particularities of German occupation in East Central Europe that, of course, targeted the Jewish population and was incredibly, terribly effective in this field. But simultaneously, it was also aimed at completely, totally destroying the institutional state order, the social and economic conditions of life, and also the cultural and ethnical landscape of the occupied territories by means of social engineering, including also physical extermination. And this is something that definitely was not the case in the Western Europe. So concluding, the problem that we are confronting when we reflect on the Irena Wiśniewska's testimony is often interpreted in terms of affirmative or heroic history versus critical revisionist history. And I would rather suggest to consider it in terms of predominant and global view of history versus the particular, unique, and regional perspective, as it is sometimes done in center periphery models or approaches and in such kind of reflection. And any attempt to grasp what could become a universal legacy of the World War II cannot disregard but have to take into account different particular experiences, memories, and viewpoints. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tomasz. Thank you for your insight. I just want to at this stage to invite our audience to share their comments or questions in the Q&A section. We'll come back to that towards the end of our meeting. And now I would like to move on to Nick Mueller asking for his remarks.
So, yes, thank you, Wojciech, and the Pilecki Institute for this wonderful partnership and bringing at least this series of 3 wonderful webinars to a close. My focus from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans today will be to look at the scale of the violence and the brutalization of both the combatants and the non-combatants as in World War II. It was just imaginable as the videos on your end have shown from a different perspective. But to speak a little bit about how our museum deals with the chaos of violence and the atrocities and the bombings on our side and other sides, and Hiroshima and torture. But I mean, just when we think about it, some 40 million non-combatants, I mean, staggering in scope and understanding and comprehension. And despite these huge numbers, museums and historians have to find a way to understand and grapple with them and never forsake at the same time or make palpable the sacrifice of those who lost their lives and the scars and the memories of those who survived. But so how do we deal with these personal accounts of eyewitnesses, testimonies or witnesses toward the end of the war? And I would say we all know that since World War II up to today, we continue to struggle for democracy and liberties and human rights. And there are examples of hate and terror that are still with us today. And we in the museum world, the history museums, have to struggle on how to present in World War II, the levels of violence and at a human level as well, perspective of soldiers and civilians at the end of the war. Before we run our 4 videos, however, I want to say something about them by introducing and giving you a glimpse of the escalation of violence and destruction and dehumanization on this massive scale and the personal impact of some of the survivors, both military and civilian. The images, I think, will speak for themselves. They're familiar because they live in our public memory, and they'll only take about 90 seconds. So if you could roll those slides, and I'll comment while they're running. First, Pearl Harbor, which for America began in '41, an attack by the Japanese on military targets, battleships and destroyers. But the shift to collateral damage in civilians was already underway in China before we even got into the war, as well as in Germany and occupied territories in Poland. The violence was reaching a crescendo, and terror bombings in Warsaw, and then by the Germans, and then Rotterdam and in London. And then comes Armageddon, really, almost in the last next few years, the last years of the attacks on Hamburg and other cities, and the fire bombings in Tokyo, and some 66 other cities in Japan just looked like this, with the intent of forcing the Japanese to surrender, and finally culminating in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, weapons of mass destruction to finally bring this war to an end. And then the awful look of the destruction, which didn't look different from the other cities, except that we have radiation now and lasting scars. And then we encounter in Europe the death camps and the survivors of we discovered some 6 million Jews who were murdered, and those survivors living with their scars. And finally, an image of a painter, Tom Lee, who looks at a Marine in the Pacific, and you just look at that face and those eyes, that vacuous 2,000 yard stare. There's no soul there anymore. He's been to hell and back, and almost without any humanity left. So these just give us a little quick reminder as to the challenges of dealing with this abstract killing on the one level and the human impact. And museums, most modern history museums, military history museums, are moving beyond just military operations. That's true with us here too, and exploring more social and cultural and even psychological portrayals of the conflict, which we have seen from some of your videos just a moment ago, is your very first one, talking about the psychological impact and personal experience of those who encountered firsthand the witnesses to the violence. Now, one of these testimonies you're about to hear is unlike the others. It's a Marine in Saipan at the famous Marpy Point. I won't tell you what happens there. It's in the last year of the war. But you will see his very moral foundations are shocked by what he encounters from the Japanese civilians who have been brainwashed to believe that the Americans, as they're occupying and attacking Saipan, are going to rape and kill and murder families, and they don't want to surrender. But this is an important example of the dehumanization and the brutalization of people's morals. The rest, I think, will be self-explanatory. So run the videos.
Fourth Marine Division Gunnery Sergeant Keith Renstrom was a close witness to 6 horrific Japanese civilian suicides at Marpy Point during the last days of the battle on the island of Saipan.
This Japanese guy just popped up out of nowhere a little further away from us, about maybe 100 yards away from us, and there was a crevice between us, and he took his baby out of his wife's hands and threw it over the side. You know, you're just shocked at what's happening like that. And then he grabbed this little boy, and the little kid was hanging on to his dad, and he finally tore him loose and threw him over. And then the little girl, she just stood and looked, and then she jumped. And then the other boy hesitated, and he pushed him over. And then the wife and him stood and bowed to each other, and she hesitated, and then he pushed her over. And then he jumped far enough out, he got into the water, and the wave took him back out. And I shot 3 shots at him with my Tommy gun. And one of the kids swore and says, "Gunny, I'll do it." And bam, with his M1, 1 shot, and that it. The blood started coming up, and then he died and sunk. I wish to this day that I had shot him when I had the chance, and I would have saved that family.
After Saipan, Renstrom made the amphibious landings at Tinian, followed by Iwo Jima, where he sustained grenade fragment wounds to his face, ending his participation in the war.
At the time.
Do you think it was a good decision to drop the bomb?
Absolutely. Anybody, in my opinion, anybody who really understands the history of that period has to conclude that it saved lives overall. Now, if you were living in the city of Hiroshima or the city of Nagasaki at that particular time, it is tough for you to accept that you gave your life or your father's life or your parents' life or whatever for the good of your country. But that's what every soldier was doing, out fighting it, whether he was killed by a rifle bullet or an atomic blast. But in essence, there are a lot of people killed there, but they were killed for the overall good, because many, many, many thousands of additional people would have been killed. Most of them would have been Japanese. Number one, and I'm not talking even in event of invasion. I don't know how many people would have been killed or wounded in the event of if we'd had to invade Japan. But I saw the hospitals they were building on in the Marianas there, all over the Marianas, and on Tinian, on Saipan, all over. And if we'd ever filled all those hospitals, it would have been a gory mess, that's all I.
It was, you know, clear day, except I noticed that there was an air raid that came on. And when the first air raid came on, we thought we should all take cover. But with one B-29 flying in the air, I guess they thought that it wasn't anything important to continue on with this air raid siren, so they stopped that air raid warning, and so everybody, you know, went again out of the shelters and moved along for wherever they were going. And when I finally reached the factory, I went inside to exchange the shoes and the rice or wheat or whatever I had for exchange. And meanwhile, all these students that were supposed to be there were outside looking at this parachute that was coming down from the sky here, and at that moment, I guess nobody knew what it was there for, but the first thing was a flash, and I was fortunately inside the building, but it got very black and dust and so forth, and it was just like, you know, the earth was breaking up, and everybody was just going to maybe going to hell, whatever it was. It was just absolutely hard to experience something like this. And when it all settled, I was completely lost, and just like I am right now. Didn't know exactly what was happening, but when I got out of this building, I noticed that I was somehow having blood all over my clothes and so forth, but I couldn't even hardly remember exactly what took place in those. It sounded like it's almost felt like it was an instant, and yet it felt so long. But first thing that everybody was thinking was, well, what is this? And when you got out, I saw all my student friends that mostly were outside looking at this parachute and so forth, and I couldn't even recognize them because they were black, and they had soot and everything else around them, and it was just a complete chaos, and it looked like almost like, you know, the whole earth was just crumbling. But
oh boy, our assignment one day was to go down this highway. I forget where we were going. I got it all in here. We were going down that highway, and they told us before we left, so now you're going to see some things you're not wanting to see, but just don't be surprised. And sure enough, I don't know how long, an hour or two after we were underway, we went by this concentration camp, and there those guys were, they heard us coming, and they were skin and bones, Seth, just standing there holding on to that wire fence. and trying to wave and trying to speak. You could tell they were trying to yell at us. They didn't have the strength. They were skin and bones, every one of them. Shit, I don't know what one it was, but boy, that was, I'll never forget that picture.
What did that make you, how did it make you feel, seeing those people?
Well, I wanted to cry, just like I'm doing now. But I knew then that we were right. And what we had done. I can still see them in my sleep. Oh, man. Shoot. Oh, wait a minute.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you.
No, that's all right. That happens whenever I think about them. That was one picture I'd never forget.
You said that you knew that you guys were right. Did that leave any doubt in your mind as to why you were there?
None whatsoever.
Did that change your attitude towards the Germans at all? I mean, obviously you weren't friendly with them to begin with. But.
No, it sure didn't. I mean, I just wanted to do more for them. Yeah. Yes, the Germans, yes, absolutely.
Well, so in all of these videos, we see a full range of emotions and the impacts of this violence that they witnessed with very different reactions and explanations from the American soldiers, the airmen, even the Japanese survivor of the A-bomb as they reflect on their experiences. And going back to the Marine, Keith Renstrom, the Marbury Point Marine, who's so emotionally outraged by this Japanese civilian suicides and the father who was throwing his kids off and pushing his wife off, that he was driven off of his own moral center and started killing civilians himself and wished he'd killed them earlier to save the others. And so this is, as I said earlier, an example of this brutalization of character and morals that seems so common for those who are firsthand eyewitnesses to the horrors of at the end of the war and any time. And then to not go in order, but John Rogers, who offers that very emotional testimony, it's a very different, reflecting the value foundations that he has and that he brings as a member of the 2nd Armored Division. And he just breaks down in horror and thinks that after killing so many Germans, that we were right. And his instinct is, what can I do to help? Wish I could do to help these people who were in the camps. But contrast John Rogers at the camp with Dutch Van Kirk, the navigator on the Enola Gay, who provides that sort of public memory justification or explanation for dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and saying we did it to save lives and to end the war. And any innocent civilians here, he's saying, now we have gone from Pearl Harbor attacking military targets to wholesale destruction of cities across Europe and Japan, and the innocent civilians had to be sacrificed, he says, like millions of soldiers who had to also sacrifice. And then one of those very Japanese under the bomb that Dutch Van Kirk dropped on Hiroshima is Nakagawa, who survived to tell his story. And it's kind of eerie. It's in a very matter-of-fact, descriptive experience these many years later. So these are very personal and moral issues at play from these eyewitnesses, and they feed into the formation of America's public memory of some of the most compelling moments of the war. And it's our museum's challenge, and just like it is for historians in the Pilecki Institute, to extract authentic public memory and collective memories from these experiences. And I would say that there is a trend line in World War II museums introducing these personal stories, which begin to replace the epic accounts and the epic visions of the war. I mean, the stories of the epic stories of the war during and after the war, with more sober and post-heroic view of these military conquests. And in this regard, as I'm concluding here, I just want to mention someone Thomas probably knows, Georg Echterkamp in Berlin at the Potsdam Military Institute, who's a leading thinker and author on the subject of violence and memory and the experience of these eyewitnesses. And as you were suggesting, Tomasz, experience and memory are two concepts that he points out that are pervasive in the national conversations about the war and how they begin to shape our memories in our post-war societies. And Echterkamp says that these individual war experiences, these personal experiences, reconnect us with the social structures in the post-war era. So when we look at these testimonies in this way, we see that war did not end at the end of the war, at least the end of the war in 45, that these experiences of violence cast long shadows that reach into the present day. And also, I think important to note that these experiences begin to cross the boundaries of time for us in museums and you in Warsaw, cross the boundaries of time and national borders. And then there's a related issue of the tensions between what is remembered and what is forgotten. How much of the violence can we bring into the museum experience? And what do we want to convey from wartime experiences? And what do we want to cover up or keep quiet? But these are important questions for all of us to answer, because it leads to this transformational phase in the immediate post-war era that has so much to do with how we perceive the major legacies of the war, both nationally in America, but even for you in Poland and indeed globally. And today's webinar, I would say, is a great example of how we can benefit by comparing European and other national approaches to these World War II experiences. And I think we are beginning to, through our small efforts here, to illuminate the tensions between the national and universal discourses. And they all point, from our perspective, they point to post-war struggles for equality and human rights and the struggles between democracy and authoritarian regimes that have been part of the global landscape since 1945. You know, when you talk about the massive statistics and bombs and artillery and gassings and genocide, and you almost, as Echterkamp says, you remove the individual from the terror of the killing, unless it's pointed at them, which the Dresden Museum I saw a few years ago does a tremendous job of, because the bombs and the coming right on top of the visitors. So we have to move beyond the killing and the violence as an abstraction on television. So in concluding here, let me just say that I think the National World War II Museum and the Pilecki Institute, we're all searching for sources of memory, hopefully collaborative memory, to help shape more universal values. And as we switch over to Rob, I want to end with this representation of one of the exhibits in the Liberation Pavilion, Eleanor Roosevelt and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, just 3 years after. So moving more toward this universal legacy. I don't need to elaborate on this, but this emerged conceptually and before the war already with Roosevelt in 1940, his 4 freedoms, and then concretely with this Declaration of Human Rights. And this impulse that comes out of these eyewitness and personal accounts, as well as the war itself, leading our own country to advances in civil rights and women's rights. And but I was most impressed with in the Solidarity Museum in Gdansk, where so much space in that museum is dedicated to the Declaration of Human Rights. It was shocking to me, and I came back and immediately enlarged the size of this. Is almost 3 meters high, 2 meters high by 4 meters wide to have an impact. And the next slide is an indication of how many languages it's translated into and how many countries have signed this. And this is an important, useful way, I think, to introduce Dr. Rob Citino, who was going to talk about this and the other themes that are developed here in our new Liberation Pavilion that will be opening in 2022. So, Rob?
Thanks, Nick. It's wonderful to be here in this webinar. It's always good to partner with our friends in Warsaw, the Pilecki Institute. The comments so far have been erudite and thought-provoking, as they always are. And I've been sitting here as a fan listening, and I learned a lot and got a lot of good ideas. Next year, the museum, the National World War II Museum, will be opening its final permanent exhibit. It's going to be called the Liberation Pavilion. There's a good exterior shot of it that you're looking at. I am what the museum calls the lead historian on the project. And the purpose of the entire Liberation Pavilion is to look at World War II's enduring relevance in the post-war period, as well as its continued relevance today and into the future. Now, I don't have to tell anyone here or our listeners that these are heavy and complex topics. They generate all sorts of what I might call intellectual problems and pitfalls. Simply defining the word relevance, of course, could take us all day as we go back and forth on that. The fact that the Liberation Pavilion will have to speak to the broad public and not merely to a narrow stratum of scholars makes the problem even thornier. Scholars like words, and I certainly do, and I've written my share of them over my career. But good museums should rarely be satisfied with posting text panels on a wall. And our National World War II Museum certainly is not satisfied with that. We strive in our galleries to be immersive, to be environmental, to be experiential. We don't really want people just standing there reading. Interactivity is one of our principal modalities. And as you've seen, the oral history is one of our principal features. Someone asked a question online, are those available in the museum? And let me just tell that questioner, they absolutely are available in the museum. Every gallery, every presentation, we don't do anything without our employing our large collection of over 10,000 oral histories of participants in World War II. So now none of this, having said that, none of this is going to be easy, and it hasn't been easy up till now. The principal problem is, of course, that liberation presupposes a kind of, it's an uplifting word. It presupposes a positive impression. And the temptation, particularly from the American perspective of public memory, would be to produce a kind of triumphalist presentation, a triumphalist portrait of the end of the war. I might call to mind ticker tape parades, returning troops, soldiers being reunited with loved ones. We've all seen the images as Americans our whole lives, but of course, we also saw some very different images in those oral histories, both Polish and American oral histories. The end of the war was a wave, a spasm of violence against civilians, as we've seen. Take our American term, our beloved term from our friend Tom Brokaw, the greatest generation. You know, it's easy to debunk that. It's also easy as Americans to understand the origins of that term, the greatest generation. But it too presupposes a kind of triumphalist, heroic epic. And I just heard my friend Nick call into play that term post-heroic, which is, I think, where we should all be when we discuss the end of the war and beyond. Take the term liberation. I don't have to tell my Polish partners in this program that the war didn't bring liberation to everyone. It certainly didn't bring it to Poland. Likewise, Western colonies in the Pacific were handed right back to their colonial overlords. It's hard to say Indonesia was liberated at the end of the war. It had to fight a very bloody war against its colonial masters to become liberated. Can you really liberate a place with industrial age, combined arms warfare, and strategic bombing, as the Allies did to Germany? So we've heard those arguments, and I engage in them all the time, and we certainly recognize their validity. But we're sticking with the term liberation, and my lodestar there, my guiding vision there, is West German President Richard Weizsäcker's 1985 speech on the 40th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe, and in which he said, with every day something became clearer, and this must be stated on behalf of all of us today. The 8th of May was a day of liberation, liberating all of us from the inhumanity and tyranny of the National Socialist regime. And I say amen to that. Now, to conclude my brief remarks today, I'd like to give you a little curtain raiser on the Liberation Pavilion. So you're getting a preview here, and feel free to spread the news far and wide about some of the images that you're about to see. It's a teaser for what we're currently building in New Orleans. We have a term in New Orleans. New Orleans is originally a French-speaking colony, of course, and we say the word lagniappe, and it means a kind of little something special, a little something extra we're giving you, and that's what these images, these visuals will be for you today. So here's some individual galleries from the Liberation Pavilion. This is the cost of victory, which relates the high price that humanity paid to beat back the threat of fascism. And it will have data about destruction of before and after photos. But please notice the centerpiece. It's not a coffin. It's a coffin crate. It's the container in which a coffin of a dead U.S. service person would be brought back to the continental United States. Our friends in the ABMC have given us, the American Battle of Monuments Commission, have given us a couple of grave markers, one cross, as you can see, and one Star of David to represent both Christian and Jewish service personnel. So we don't want liberation to be nothing but ticker tape parades. We'll talk about that phenomenon, but we also want people to contemplate, our visitors to contemplate the deep price that the entire world paid to beat back fascism. The next slide will take us into the gallery, and then they came for me. This is the museum's first comprehensive portrait of the horrors of the Holocaust. We'll refract it through a number of various lenses, Hitler's own vicious racism and his racial project, the story of Anne Frank and her family's hidden annex in Amsterdam, which we're going to evoke, not reproduce, but to evoke in our gallery. The horrific system of the death camps and the liberation of the camps by Allied and especially U.S. forces. We do emphasize the American perspective throughout, as we've done really since the beginning of the museum. If I can see the next slide, please, Jeremy. And that, I think, is one more from 1.4, and then they came for me. And there's we have here General Eisenhower visiting a concentration camp and being horrified at what he saw. That's the photo on the left. And summoning reporters from various countries, also US personnel of all sorts to witness exactly what the Nazis had been up to in these facilities. His famous quote is, we've heard it said that the American serviceman doesn't know what he's fighting for. Well, now at least he knows what he was fighting against, and that's probably as good an evocation of this as we could. Next, please. We'll have a gallery called Restoring Justice, which will provide the visitor with an introduction to the Nuremberg Trials as well as other war crimes proceedings. About 24 high-ranking Nazis were tried at Nuremberg, but as you may know, a lot more than that were tried at various other war crimes trials. In Dachau, for example, the US Army put 2,400, 2,500 so-called lesser Nazis on trial and condemned a large number of them, highlighting the importance in the restoration of freedom and human rights. So next, Jeremy, please. Later on the second level of the Liberation Pavilion, we'll have prosperity and change, which will look at developments in post-war American society, an extremely wealthy place, but a place also kind of torn apart by social instabilities, demands for rights by previously marginalized groups, which we believe were given a great impetus by the events of World War II. Next, please. Just a couple of slides here on the fight for freedom, which will be the American foreign policy and Western foreign policy in the post-war world, the Cold War, the formation of NATO, the fact that America, despite variations from time to time, followed a fairly consistent policy with regards to its NATO allies and in opposition to the Soviet Union and its dragooned allies, including Poland, who were members of the Warsaw Pact. And you'll see another slide here, which will indicate the commitment to global leadership through the lens of FDR's 4 freedoms, a kind of photo montage of the 4 freedoms being violated in World War II and then hopefully being revived and defend freedom of speech and worship, freedom from fear and want. Roosevelt's moral framework of what World War II in his eyes was all about. And finally, what does World War II mean today will be a call on our visitors to remember the wartime generation, the achievement in protecting freedom, and the new society they built. Here we'll ask our visitors to answer the question at an interactive kiosk. What does World War II mean to you? Or did you have a relative in World War II? What would you say to him or her if you could? What do you think World War II meant? And those answers interactively then projected onto the large screen, as you can see in the slide. So I look out my window. The building is already rising out of the ground, and hopefully we'll see you all in late 2022. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. That was a series of very interesting set of remarks, and from Nick, from Tomasz, and from Rob. And I have this unfortunate feeling that we're sort of having only 10 minutes to actually conclude the entire webinar. So we should start with some roundtable discussion right now, and then still have a moment to return to the questions that are posed by our listeners. So just since the time is narrow here, I want to, because from my perspective, what is really interesting here is that we're really trying, and that's what we're doing in your museum, we're trying to go beyond the nationalistic memory about the Second World War, or national memory of the Second World War, and look for more universal perspectives or universal features of how to remember the war. And I'm wondering, because there are 2 basic ways you can look into the memory of the Second World War. One is the commemoration. And this is something you perhaps call this heroic memory. You commemorate the fallen troops, right? I mean, and they deserve that. And I mean, if you take this away, it's like part of the very important understanding what the war was about is sort of gone. So that's memory as a commemoration. But on the other hand, you have memory of the Second World War as some sort of instruction to the contemporary generation or to the future generations. And do you have this feeling that when we talk about shifts in what matters in memory of the Second World War, we're sort of moving from one pole to the other, or this is like a combined way of memorizing or memorializing the Second World War? Because on one hand, we do need monuments. We do need things that we want to refer to and say, like, yes, that was the right war. These people sacrificed their lives and we should appreciate that. And I think in the United States, it's actually a very powerful tradition of appreciating and acknowledging the troops in the field. In the end, there is this other aspect when we want to actually explain that, well, if you destroy everything, then you have to find ways to reconstruct it, and that's the part of our mission. How would you? What is your take on that? Maybe you start with Nick.
Well, in terms of extracting a common denominator from out of these experiences, as I suggested a moment ago, from these memories of experiences, I think it leads you to broader, more universal issues, I would hope, of freedom, and as why we look back to the four freedoms, for example. Obviously, the atrocities of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, and the atomic bomb. I mean, the nuclear terror is still with us. Individuals who experienced that both during and immediate aftermath of the war, I mean, drove our nation and others to more of these universal values and ideals. Very, very difficult to implement worldwide, but they motivated all the presidents up through the President Bush. We're all World War II veterans, and that is and they carried forward. It didn't matter if it was Republican or Democrat. They carried forward some of those ideals in their foreign policies and in the domestic policies. So I think these common values and experiences for those major takeaways. A lot of the campaigns, the operations of what happened on either sides and the causes of the war. I mean, most in the public memory, much of that will be slowly forgotten. I think these social, psychological impressions and memories will lead more both across boundaries of time and country, lead more to the more universal aspects. Whether or not we realize those is up to future generations.
Tomasz, I think that in Poland, the commemoration is a part of a great effort to restore justice. Rob mentioned about restoration of justice, or actually Nuremberg Trials, as a way of dealing with war crimes and with Nazi crimes. But in Poland, the feeling is, I believe, a little bit different. I mean, the lack of justice is actually the first impression that we get when we talk about our memory about the Second World War.
The lack of what?
The lack of justice. Actually, yeah. Nuremberg trials were absolutely not enough from the perspective we take. Tomasz, go ahead.
Yes,
Briefly.
I agree. Of course, the lack of justice is the experience of the war and its legacy. In Poland, given the fact that most of the war criminals remained unpunished, some of them even unknown, and we are still seeking to find out even their identities. And this is the case of German perpetrators, war criminals, but of course we also have the other side, the communist, the Soviet side of the story, when we are lacking, or we can speak about the failure of justice, not only in the case of individuals, but generally. There was no Nuremberg trials for the Soviet communism. And when we are today reflecting on memory wars that we encounter and experience, and when we in Poland confront ourselves with the memory cultures in Germany on the one hand and in Russia on the other, we can really experience how important it is to settle the things right, to name good and evil in the history, if not on this individual level of trials and prosecutions, which is also, of course, very important, at least on this symbolic level, where monuments, speeches of the politicians, and other public gestures play an important role. Polish relations and Polish historical dialogue with Germany on the one hand and with Russia on the other is completely different from this point of view.
Thank you, Tomasz. Rob, a few more sentences.
Sure, I will be brief. My own specialty is, as a historian, is Germany. And of course, German memory is the most fraught of all. The country once had a reputation as a highly civilized intellectual powerhouse that dominated the Nobel Prize winners. And then suddenly in the 1930s, it became something very, very different. And then at the end of the war, there weren't just one Germany, there were two Germanys. So there were two memories, one of which the now vanished East Germany claimed no responsibility whatsoever for anything that had happened in the previous 12 years, because that was a communist state, and it blamed the capitalists who were running Germany at the time and saw fascism incorrectly as a kind of tool of large finance capital. But you know, it's even more complicated. There was a third German memory, and that of course is Austria. So which portrayed itself as one of the first victims of Nazism rather than one of the participants in the crimes of the Third Reich. So maybe I'll just be the pessimist, and maybe I'm the pessimist because I study German history, and it came to that bad end in 1945. It's very difficult I think, to harmonize a kind of memories. I think that those are always going to be dividing lines. Wars have winners and wars have losers, and it's going to be very difficult, I think, for the winners and losers ever really to come together. I fear if they do, then World War II just becomes something that happened to all of us. That it was an external force. We even say it in English, the war killed 50 million people. You know, we always say that. And it's a funny way of phrasing it. No, humans killed each other. 50 million humans killed each other. The war didn't kill anybody. So I think about this a lot. And I would like to say that there's one specific memory or group of them that we can fasten on. I'm not sure in my lifetime.
Thank you very much.
Justice, the restoring justice, or the search for justice, is probably not the same for Americans as it is for Poland and others in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, because we didn't feel the boot of the Nazis on our necks in the war in that way. So restoring justice is through more the Nuremberg Trials and what America felt through the experience of the war, that it was important to find a new type of justice. Whether they're really restoring it, we're really creating a new standard for international law against crimes against humanity. But there is the pressure to find justice on the social level in the United States as a consequence of those who fought, which means the struggles for civil rights and women's rights and other forms of equality. So that form of justice, you could say, is a common denominator, but I think different from the way it is in Poland.
I think that discussing the restoration of justice, or perspectives on justice after the Second World War, could be a great topic for another webinar at some point in the future. For now, since we're already 2 minutes beyond our time, I just want to thank Rob for answering 3 questions, I think, himself on the Q&A. You're welcome. We're supposed to, I wanted to get to them, but we won't really have much time. I just want to say, for those who are interested, the witness accounts that you have seen and more are available on the Pilecki Institute YouTube channel, also with English subtitles at least to a certain degree. This was one of the questions, well, there was also a request to go beyond European or Europe-centric perspectives. We had it a little bit in Nick's presentation, but we could continue that given the time, that if we had this time. And one mention about the World War II Museum in Gdansk. It's wonderful. It's a great museum. Unfortunately, we can only visit it. We haven't built it. We haven't been involved in creating it. That's one of the questions that I also found from Cheryl Crawford. Thank you very much for that. And we really need to conclude. I'm really, really grateful for this wonderful meeting, and I thank you to the panel for all your insights and perspectives, and helping me also to understand how memory of the Second World War is still a challenge for us, and how we have to grapple with that, so that it's powerful and it's compelling to the contemporary audiences. I hope this is not going to be the last partnered webinar, but the series with this one, the 3-part series, has been concluded, and I wish you a wonderful evening in Poland and the beautiful rest of the day in the States. All the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Wojciech and to Tomasz for your wonderful partnership and collaboration with us. I know Rob Citino and I and our current president and CEO, Stephen Watson, are all very appreciative of the efforts that everyone made to make this a success.
I'll just say thank you to the very erudite questions that were posed as well. I tried to get to some of them, and there's a lot more. Our audience was really the top notch for this intellectually challenging program. So thanks to everyone.
Let's thank the audience.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.